Hi, everyone. Happy Monday afternoon. Here's a look at your weather outlook across the United States. Going to be talking about five different storm systems, atmospheric rivers, and the polar vortex. As really the summary this week is really defined by an amplified northwest flow pattern that's going to bring a lot of rain and mountain snow for portions of the northwest. Pretty warm and dry for a lot of the southwest. Cold and more cold for a lot of the northeast quadrant of the U.S., with rounds of snow and then kind of below average temperatures as well for a lot of the southeast. Now, in terms of the storm systems, storm number one right now is kind of across the mid-Atlantic. That's bringing some snow down across Virginia. Winter storm warnings and winter weather advisories as far to the coast, including Virginia Beach. Storm number two here's this quick moving Alberta Clipper Lake system across the northern plains. Those two are going to be moving off to the east very quickly over the next 24 hours. Storm number three is just coming on shore here across the Pacific Northwest. And this is kind of a part of a broader series of atmospheric river systems moving into the Pacific Northwest. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the flooding concerns that are going to be evolving, particularly for the state of Washington. And we'll see additional storms as we move through this week. We'll see another one coming in later Wednesday. That's all these are going to basically be moving and dropping into the northern plains, Great Lakes, and Northeast through the week. So again, storm number one out here, storm number two moving across the Great Lakes. System number three then moves into the Northern Plains, Great Lakes, kind of digs and amplifies here midweek as system number four moves into the Pacific Northwest, and that digs down. And then basically we have sort of a system number five that drops in. And this isn't necessarily the polar vortex itself, but we are seeing a lot of wobbling of the polar vortex, and that's kind of been resulting in some of these temporary cold air intrusions. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And again, this is our 500 millibar vorticity map. So this is mid-levels of the atmosphere, of the troposphere, and it's helpful for us to sort of identify the location, timing, and intensity of storms. So right now we see from the National Weather Service, I mentioned storm number one, bringing, 2 to 4+ inches of snow across the mid-Atlantic system. Number two is bringing some light snow across the North Plains and some moderate snow as well. And then sort of preparing for that system number three, bringing in more wind and snow across Pacific, across the Midwest. And then storm number three is resulting in a lot of wind advisories and flood watches across the Pacific Northwest. Now, I want to talk more about what's happening across the Pacific Northwest. One way we can look at these atmospheric rivers, which is essentially kind of what it sounds like. It's a river of higher atmospheric moisture. And so instead of actual water, it's sort of water vapor. And eventually, once that gets forced up over the mountains across the west, that turns into liquid water, turns into rain and snow. But it sort of comes in, and how we look at the intensity and duration of these really is by looking at the vapor, the amount of moisture within the storms. And we can sort of look at the intensity of how that moisture gets advected into these jets of moisture, and then how long that lasts. And that sort of really dictates how much rain and snow falls. It can also give us a sense of the types of impacts that are expected. So right now we're looking at portions across the coast of Washington here. And I want to call out from left to right, we're looking across time. Where this black line is, that's current time. And the y-axis is sort of the intensity of integrated vapor transport. So the amount of water vapor, how much of that, and how intensely it's being advected or moved in off of strong winds. That combination can tell us sort of the intensity of an atmospheric river. And the first thing to point out is we had sort of this yellow, or category 3 of 5 atmospheric river impact the Pacific Northwest over the weekend, late last weekend of the weekend. And now we're approaching this category 4, almost, scale 5 atmospheric river. It's going to kind of come in 2 waves per se, but it's a long duration atmospheric river. And there's a couple of problems with this. You had antecedent moisture that's really already brought up your soil moistures and your streams and rivers and things like that. But you do have some snowpack that has fallen with a couple of storms high up in the mountains. So you have a lot of runoff that's now happening between this antecedent storm and now this storm as well. So we're really going to see some issues with potential flooding and river flooding across, especially the state of Washington, some concerns in Oregon as well, but a lot of rivers across the state of Washington are expected to go into flood stage, some of them approaching record high values. So really over the next 24 hours, we're going to be talking about some potentially pretty major river flooding across portions of western Washington. And in terms of, the total rainfall, again, a lot of areas have already seen multiple inches of rainfalls in the recent days. And as we really head through this week, we have kind of one main system, another happening later this week. But as we get to essentially Friday evening, we're going to see, 2 to 4 inches of additional rainfall for a lot of the valleys in Washington. And then, really 5 to 10 inches plus across the higher terrain in the mountains. Most of this is going to fall as rain higher up. We're going to see a lot of snow in the mountains. And as you get further east, where you have more coincidence of the moisture with the cold air, you're going to get a lot of snow, especially for the Bitterroot Mountains, for the Tetons, and across a lot of Montana, Colorado, and portions of the west and south of that. Not going to get a lot of snow this week out of this pattern. I'm kind of just talking about the winter weather impacts I mentioned before. Winter storm 1 is going to be bringing some snow over the next few hours here, departing tonight across the Virginia area. System number 2 brings, minor to perhaps locally moderate impacts of snowfall with this first system, but also this second system coming in midweek. And then really, you will see locally higher impacts from some of these storms in the higher mountain terrains. A lot of these are sort of very remote areas, but for some of the mountain passes, especially those that are higher, could be seeing some pretty major impacts throughout this week as these series of systems move through. Now, if we go back to the forecast, kind of want to mention again, what we're expecting in terms of winter precipitation, in terms of total snowfall. I mentioned the heavy rainfall out west. This is also going to manifest as a lot of snow for the mountains. We'll be measuring it in feet across Tetons, Bitterroots, Cascades, Northern Cascades, and then other mountain ranges across Montana as well. The storm number 2 that I'd mentioned is going to bring kind of a quick dusting. It's sort of this Alberta Clipper-like system. It's going to bring a quick dusting. It's also going to sort of reinforce cold air behind it. But we've watched this System 3 move out of the Pacific Northwest, and that's actually going to bring more snow as we head into Wednesday. And behind that, we're going to see sort of another reinfiltration of cold air. What I also want to bring to your attention is this sort of system number 3 comes out here. That sort of digs and it kind of catches up with this trough. And this is really what we've been seeing is this broad troughing across the northeast quadrant of the U.S. really for the last 3 to 4 weeks here. And this has sort of just been indicative of, this more unstable polar vortex pattern. Now, I want to call out, this isn't the direct polar vortex impact in the United States. It's really just been the polar vortex kind of wobbling. And at times you have lobes of the polar vortex kind of digging into Canada, and that's helping bring in colder air and, basically amplifying a lot of the storm systems that are moving across the northeast. And as we really go through this week, we're going to continue to see sort of round after round of storms that are going to bring back in and advect back down really cold air that's sitting up in Canada. As we get later into the week, system number 4 kind of digs in here. And then really what it does is it sort of taps into this other trough up here and helps kind of pull that down. And that together is going to bring another round of cold air. And we look at where we're at for surface temperatures and, sort of compared to average. A lot of areas 10 to 20 degrees below average, really for the northeastern quadrant of the U.S., 5 to 15 to 20 degrees above average for a lot of the western U.S. You kind of see that moderates a little bit by Tuesday and into Wednesday. But what happens is here comes system number 3 moving in. Again, it's going to bring sort of a swath of snow to northern plains into the Great Lakes. But behind that, you're going to see this cold air come back in, especially for the upper Midwest into the Northeast as we head into later in the week. And then really what we watch happen behind systems number 4 and 5, if those kind of work together, is another really big plunge of cold air. Temperatures, I mean, we're talking about, potentially 30 to 40 degrees below average for parts of the northern plains, Midwest by this weekend. And that continues to move in the Northeast. So continued cold. And really, this is sort of expected when we look at the Climate Prediction Center. The temperature outlook is, very highly confident or very probable that we'll see, below average temperatures across the northeast quadrant of the U.S., and then below average as well for the southeast, and above average for the northwest. In much of the western U.S. But as we go beyond and into next week, it looks like this pattern more or less continues. Pretty active in terms of precipitation across the Pacific Northwest, warm for a lot of areas, and then below average temperatures are looking continued more than likely as we go into periods of next week. Just kind of wanted to call out. I'm not going to go into this too much, but we have been talking about a sudden stratospheric warming that happened at the end of November. We've been seeing sort of this Arctic oscillation, a way which we can look at sort of the stability, the polar vortex. Sometimes, more times than not, when we see these sudden stratospheric warmings, these SSWs we call them, we do tend to see some reflection of that making it towards the surface and actually seeing the polar vortex making more of a wobble or direct intrusion further south. And this tends to impact the central or eastern US. So I think what this suggests is it's still not clear how this is going to manifest. If we're going to see, larger disruption, we are seeing pretty negative Arctic oscillation values right now. So that's kind of why we're seeing the wobbliness of that. That's probably going to continue, I suspect, as we go through the month of December. I wouldn't be surprised if we still see potentially, even another bigger shot of cold air. I think if that's going to happen, that's going to probably happen more towards middle to later portions of the month. Again, because we had this warming event high up in the stratosphere, does not always mean that we get this big disruption of the polar vortex. We're kind of seeing these minor disruptions. There is a chance, though, that we could see a bigger disruption of that and maybe perhaps a bigger period of cold air by mid to late month. For now, that's all I have. Have a great week.